Hi everyone, now we're back with another video looking at cardiovascular system essentials. Now the cardiovascular, we're actually dividing that system into two different videos just because blood vessels and blood itself has a lot of information in it, and the cardiovascular part that contains the heart actually has a lot more details. So in this video we are covering the blood and the vessels. Okay, so the cardiovascular system is also sometimes referred to as the circulatory system, and they're composed of blood vessels. That's essentially what the blood flows through, so that's the other component, and the heart. The heart is so critical in this cardiovascular system because it kind of pushes the blood around the body. Now, the function of the cardiovascular system, there's a lot of functions to them. The first one is that they transport oxygen, and we'll talk about some other gases too that it transport, and nutrients, because remember, every tissue of the body has to have nutrients to survive. It can also transport hormones, and when we spoke about the endocrine system in a previous video, you saw how important hormones were, and they are actually not all of them, but a lot of them do go through circulation to find their target cells. And it also helps to transport metabolic waste. And when we spoke about the urinary system or the excretory system, you saw that in action. If you did not see those, please take a look at those videos. Another thing that the cardiovascular system provides is protection. This is more so looking at some of the factors that's found in blood, like white blood cells, antibodies, and there's other immune factors like complement that are circulated through the cardiovascular system. Then we have clotting and also regulation of body temperature. So these are the typical functions of the cardiovascular system. If you take a look here at the body, you will see the heart at the center. That will be in a separate video, but we see our arteries, which are the red blood vessels, and we have the veins, which are the blue vessels shown here. And this is just a simplified picture. Okay, so the first part of this cardiovascular system that we will talk about is the blood. All right, so the blood is actually divided into two parts. We have the formed elements of the blood, which contains the cell, which I'm going to talk about here. And then we have more liquid portion of the blood. So the first to start off with, blood is red typically because we have red blood cells. Red blood cells are one of the most important cells circulating in our system. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but they contain hemoglobin that helps transport certain things throughout the body. Now, when they're mature, they lose their nucleus and they have this concave type appearance that we see here. Now, there are also other formed elements that includes platelets. Now, platelets they play a critical role in blood clotting. Then we have our white blood cells. So we have the monocyte macrophage system, where these are the phagocytic cells that kind of wander around the blood and engulf anything that appears to be foreign. We have our lymphocytes that give rise to our B and T cells. And then we have our granular cytes, which includes eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils, with neutrophils being the most abundant in the blood. This will be discussed a little further when we talk about the immune system, but these all make the formed elements of the blood. So just to stress, I want to mention a little bit more about the red blood cells. So red blood cells, because of their structure and the hemoglobin that they contain, that allows them to transport things around the body, and typically the gases that they transport typically are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So those are the normal things that are transported. So carbon dioxide that's built up in your system from metabolism, so example, making ATP, that carbon dioxide has to be released out the body. So when we talk about pulmonary circulation, you're going to see how the red blood cells will transport that carbon dioxide to the lungs where it can then leave. Whereas oxygen can diffuse across The red blood cells can pick up the oxygen and take it to where it needs to go in the body. Those are the two typical, but I'm going to ask the other Dr. V a question. Can red blood cells hold on or transport any other type of gases?
Yes, it can. Red blood cells can also carry nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator. That means blood vessels can get bigger to carry more blood. And it also can carry carbon monoxide, which is not typical. This is when you have an issue with a buildup of carbon monoxide holding on to the hemoglobin, preventing oxygen from binding. So this is actually a deadly situation that you don't want.
Okay, so this right here is the actual structure of the hemoglobin. That is the transporting unit of the gases that we just discussed. So hemoglobin is made up of 2 chains, 2 beta chains, and 2 alpha chains that we see here. And each one of these chains contain a heme. And what the heme actually have in it is iron.
That's correct. And the thing about iron is that each iron molecule can bind an oxygen molecule. And so this is how the hemoglobin molecule can transport oxygen throughout the bloodstream.
So if someone has low levels of hemoglobin, then they won't be able to transport as much oxygen, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that disorder in a little while. All right, so since we're talking about red blood cells, there's something really important we do need to talk about, and that is blood typing. Every human being on this planet has a blood type, and we have 4 different blood types. Now, the question is, how is blood type determined? Now, on each red blood cells, there is something called antigens. Antigens. And typically, your white blood cells will go around your body and it will be looking at all the antigens on your cell. And if it looks like it's something that you typically have, it won't try to attack it. So if someone is type A blood, okay, type A, the antigens that they display on their surface are actually A antigens. So that means their body would typically recognize it as A antigens and as self. So the problem lies with that is that they cannot take any other antigen type that's different from A. So that means they will have anti-B antibodies circulating. So antibodies are produced by your B cells, and they target anything that is not self proteins. All right, so if you're a type A blood and you receive type B blood in a blood transfusion, the antibodies that you see here will attack the type B blood, causing the blood to clump. Vice versa, if you're type B, that means you have B antigens on your surface. That means that your body cannot tolerate any antigen like antigen A coming into your body. So if you have type B blood, you are producing anti-A antibodies. Now here's the thing with these two. All right, so even though you have type A and type B, if you're type A, you can always donate to a type A person. If you're a type B, you can donate to a type B person. But let me skip over this for a second and let me go here. Type O has no antigens. Okay, so you don't see A and you don't see B. They have none. So because they don't have any antigens, they can be considered the universal donor. Okay, they can donate to any blood type. Now let's go to AB. AB blood type has both A antigens and both B antigens. So if they have both antigens, that means they will not have any antibodies that will attack A or B blood type. So because of that, they're called the universal recipient. They can receive blood from type A, type B, or type O. Now, type A can only receive blood from type A and type O. Type B can receive blood from type B and type O. So this is important to know the different blood types, to know your blood type before you can go ahead and receive blood from somebody, because if you do not have the right blood type and the person has the antibodies, they will attack the foreign antigen that's coming in. Now, there's another factor that we have in our body that's not on here, and that's called the Rh factor. That's another concern that we see in pregnant women, because if they are Rh factor negative, that's another factor found in the cell, and their child is Rh positive, they may run a risk in the future of having issues with future pregnancy. So just to let you know about blood typing, we have type A, type B, type AB, and type O. And what determines that is the antigen that's on the surface of the cell. And if we know the antigen on the surface of the cell, we know their blood type. And you have to be careful not to get the wrong blood type. All right, so now let's talk about the liquid part of the blood that contains the plasma and some of the soluble proteins. So plasma makes up about 46 to 63% of the blood. And the majority of the plasma is composed of water. So 92% of plasma is water. The rest of them contains different plasma proteins, regulatory proteins, and other solutes like gases. All right, so on this side, we're showing you what blood will look like if you actually had it separated out. So this is looking at a normal blood sample. Dr. V, can you explain what's going on here?
Sure. So the first question is, how do you separate out the blood to look like it does in the tubes? Well, you have to centrifuge it. So when you spin the blood samples, it separates into the different components. If we look at the first one, which is considered normal, the plasma contains the water, nutrients, hormones, and other factors. The second layer is called the buffy coat, which contains the white blood cells and platelets. And then the last component are the blood cells, specifically red blood cells, and that makes up the hematocrit portion of the sample. Now, if we look at the other two, they look slightly different. If we look at the middle component, we now have less hematocrit. And this is what a person's blood would look like who was suffering from anemia. Anemia is not having enough of the hematocrit or the red blood cells. And so that person typically will not have a lot of oxygen delivery, and they would typically be very, very fatigued or tired due to that fact. We'll talk about that more later. The last tube, you see that it is an increased hematocrit. This is known as polycythemia. And this person typically has an elevated red blood cell component, and it outweighs or overshadows the fluid compartment or the fluid component. So they have very little water and proteins, nutrients, and hormones in their blood.
Okay, very interesting. This is a very interesting picture to see because we hear about anemia a lot, and that's actually something that's common in present day. So this is showing you anemia. Since there's a lot of individuals that have anemia, I think it's a good thing to talk about. So anemia typically is associated with low hemoglobin levels, and these are some of the symptoms that are associated with it. So their central nervous system can be impacted because you remember hemoglobin is what helps to transport the gases like oxygen, and your brain needs oxygen for function. So if you have decreased oxygen, the person will experience fatigue, dizziness, and under severe cases of anemia, they can potentially faint. Some individuals may have low blood pressure. Their heart may be impacted where they can have palpitations where it feels like they're skipping a heartbeat. They can have rapid heart rate, typically because we see that drop in the low blood pressure. And under severe cases, you can even have heart attack and chest pains, which are pretty serious. You can have yellowing of eyes. You can have paleness of the skin, shortness of the breath, and muscular weakness, and change of stool color. Now, anemia is pretty serious if the hemoglobin level is low. So if it is low, it's important for that individual to go and get treatment for hemoglobin levels, low hemoglobin levels.
It's interesting, actually, if you are suffering from anemia or have any of these symptoms and think that you're suffering from anemia, you might want to go to the doctor to get your hemoglobin levels checked. Typically, it varies slightly by the numbers, but a hemoglobin level less than 10 is considered to be low. Now, if you have a low hemoglobin, the treatment for that is iron replacement. So you typically have to get iron pills to improve your anemia. Therefore, it helps you bind more oxygen, and it kind of reverses that situation.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so now we're moving away from the blood, and we're going to talk about the vessels that the blood run through. We call those blood vessels. So just taking a look at this picture right here, we have an artery cross-section and a vein cross-section. Immediately looking at it, you can see that there is one that has more structure and support to it. And if you said the artery looks like it has the most support, you're absolutely correct. So Dr. V, can you explain the difference between an artery and a vein, why the artery looks so rigid and strong while the vein looks like it's kind of folding in on itself?
Sure. So if we look at the image to the right, we see the breakdown of what makes up the two type of vessels. And the thing that's hugely different between arteries and veins essentially is the muscular layer. The smooth muscle layer of the artery is much thicker. And this is because they operate under higher pressures and they can control their diameter with the muscular layer. Some other components to this layer is the endothelium. You have the external elastic lamina, so arteries are more elastic than veins are. You have the internal elastic lamina. You have a basement membrane, and then you have the adventitia. Now, if we go over to the vein, we do see an endothelium. We see a smaller smooth muscle layer. We see a basement membrane, and we also see adventitia. But we see one thing that is not present in the artery, and that is a valve. We'll talk about that a little later. Now, capillaries are represented here as well, and they connect the two. So here we have the vascular tree, and exactly the way it sounds is the way I want you guys to look at it. A tree has branches, and so we start with the artery because arteries are the first blood vessels to leave the heart. And if you go like you're looking at a tree, the arteries become arterioles, which are smaller arteries that have smooth muscle as well, and they do a lot more changing of radius or diameter. Now, if you continue down the tree, you now get to the capillaries. So the arterioles become capillaries, and these are the vessels of gas exchange and nutrient exchange. When we go further down, we get more branching into the venules, which are smaller veins, and then on to the veins themselves. Now, we talked about valves and why they're important for veins. The valves essentially work similarly to the valves of your heart. What they do is they prevent blood flow from flowing backwards. So we say that they prevent backflow from occurring. Now, why would blood flow backwards in a vein if there were no valves? This is very simple. Because veins are the last in line in the vascular tree, they're farther away from the heart. And so the pressure that's pushing the blood forward is at its least force when we get to the veins. And so they need the help of the valves to prevent the blood from flowing backwards and to continue the forward flow of the blood back to the heart.
Very interesting. Also, the muscles, the skeletal muscles, also help to provide compression for these veins to continue the blood flow through the system. Like example, if you're sitting down too long on a plane ride or a road trip, you may get some blood not flowing properly because your muscles are not tense. So it's always good to kind of stretch and walk around to get that blood flowing. Sometimes there are some other issues that are associated with the vein, like varicose veins. Sometimes you can get some of these valves not functioning correctly, and you get some backflow, so you get some bulging going on in the veins. So remember, the veins contain valves. Arteries don't have valves because artery receives a lot more pressure from the heart and the blood can continue to flow, whereas the veins are further away. So remember the order. We start off with artery, then it becomes an arteriole, then capillary, then venule, then vein. Okay, so here this is showing you the blood vessels of the body. This looks like a mass chaos, but it really isn't that bad. What I'm trying to show you here, when we're referring to blood vessels, if we're saying that there is an artery, there typically is a vein running right by it with the similar name. So if we take a look here, like a pulmonary artery, you'll have a pulmonary vein. If you have a renal vein, you have a renal artery. So I want you to see that the names are pretty common regarding vein and artery. Another thing to remember it, because if you're in A&P or if you're in biology, you may have to memorize each one of these veins and arteries depending on, what your teacher is requiring. But it's easy to remember the name of the veins and arteries based on its location. So if you take a look here as an example, the popliteal region is the region around the knee or behind the knee, just that vicinity, that area. So if you know popliteal has to do with something around that region by the knee, the popliteal artery and vein will be there. Same thing with the tibial artery. It's around the tibia bone. The radial and ulnar arteries, same thing around the radius and the ulnar bones. So just typically where the location is will kind of give you the name. Like the axillary vein and artery are typically found in the axillary region, which is around the armpits. So just an easy way to remember it, where is the location of the vein that most likely will give you the name. And if there is a name of a vein, there most likely is a name of an artery with the same name running close by. So that's an easy way to kind of remember it.
So this slide just reinforces the importance of capillary beds. And what it shows is that we typically have capillary beds at all major sites, organ system sites. And this shows the need for gas exchange and nutrient exchange for all these regions. And so if you have an important area of the body, you're definitely going to have capillary networks near those systems.
So examples like the renal system, we have the renal artery and the renal vein, where you have filtration and other things happening, you need to have capillaries there. Also, the pulmonary circulation, gas exchange. So typically where you have a lot of exchange, you have these capillary beds.
And so I wanted to point out something that you usually see represented in a lot of images that talk about the cardiovascular system. You have veins being represented as blue and arteries being represented as red. Red is showing that you have oxygen in that portion. And so typically, if you notice, the arteries are going to be red in most cases. And then if you look at the veins, they're going to be blue. All right, so if you look, why does the color change from red to blue once you leave the capillaries? This is because the capillaries deliver that oxygen to those tissues. And then when the blood continues on, it now has to go back to the heart to get more oxygen.
Okay. And sometimes we see a little flip when we talk about the pulmonary circulation, which will be discussed when we get to the respiratory system. Okay, so there are certain things that can actually go wrong with the blood vessels. One of the most common ones that we hear about are aneurysms. So can you explain, Dr. V, what is an aneurysm?
Sure. So an aneurysm is when you have a blood vessel that has the muscle layer is either weak or damaged. And what that allows for is that segment to balloon out. In other words, it stretches to a point where it cannot maintain its shape and strength or rigidity. And so if it balloons out far enough, it can put pressure on surrounding tissues and then eventually will rupture. And so that's what an aneurysm is. And you can have them in the brain. All right? So it's called a cerebral aneurysm. And so those typically are what often people think of when you say aneurysm as the cerebral aneurysm.
Yes, I mean, there are reasons why aneurysms could occur. There's several reasons why this can happen. I know some microbial infections can actually be linked to aneurysms because sometimes the microbes or the inflammatory response can actually damage that arterial wall, causing it to balloon out over time. What are some other causes of aneurysms?
If someone has chronic high blood pressure or hypertension, the vessels have to deal with such forces over time that you can get areas that get weak because of that elevated chronic blood pressure levels. And that can cause an aneurysm at some point.
Okay. So aneurysms can potentially be very deadly, especially if it occurs very close to the heart, because a lot of blood will be lost in a short period of time. All right, another disorder that is seen is sickle cell anemia. This is not of the blood vessels, it's actually of the blood. Sickle cell is caused by a mutation in an amino acid, and that one mutation actually changed that nice, wonderful shape that we know, that round shape we see for the red blood cells. They have now become this crescent type shape. This is called the sickle cell shape. And a lot of times when they're flowing through the capillaries, because of their shape, they can get stuck. And if they get stuck, they block the capillaries, leading to something called a crisis. If it gets really bad, it can actually lead to organ failure, organ damage, and some other issues that can happen. So sickle cell is not a great thing because of its potential of blocking blood flow. All right, so it's quiz time. Let's see what you remember about blood and blood vessels. Right, which blood vessel contains thicker, smooth muscle? Is it veins, arteries, capillaries, or do they all contain very thick smooth muscle? Okay, so the answer is arteries. Remember, artery has a very thick, smooth muscle layer, and it also contains the elastic layers. All right, next question. Which blood vessels contain valves to prevent backflow of blood? Is it veins, arteries, capillaries, or all of the above? Remember, we said that veins have valves, okay? And remember, because veins are so farthest away from the heart, it doesn't have that force to get the blood going through, so you have those valves. Next question. If a person has anti-B and anti-A antibodies, what blood type would they be? So if they have anti-A and anti-B, so that means they can't get either of them. They're type O. Okay? Okay, so hopefully you got type O. All right, what is the proper order of the vascular tree? All right, so hopefully you remember this. So this one says arterial, artery, capillaries, veins, venules. Artery, arterial, capillaries, venules, veins. Capillary, artery, arterial, venules, veins. Venules, vein, arterioles, arteries, capillaries are none of the above. So if you remember the vascular tree, you should say that it's artery, then becomes arterial, then capillary, then venules, then veins. All right, next one. What is the liquid form of blood called? Is it plasma, red blood cells, platelets, serum, or all of the above? Hopefully you picked plasma. What does hemoglobin normally transport? Select all of that applies. Is it carbon dioxide, oxygen, sulfur, magnesium, or carbon monoxide? The question is, what does hemoglobin normally transport? So hopefully you picked carbon dioxide and oxygen. So even though carbon monoxide can also be bounded to red blood cells, to the hemoglobin, that is not normally transported. So it's carbon dioxide and oxygen. An aneurysm is caused by a weakened blood vessel wall, a strong blood vessel wall, a tear in blood vessel wall, a clot in the blood vessel wall, or none of the above. So the answer is a weakened blood vessel wall. Okay? Now, if there's a tear, you're bleeding. You're bleeding through. So that's when it has completely ruptured. So it's typically caused by a weakened blood vessel wall. So hopefully you got 100% on this quiz. If you didn't, please go back and watch it again so you can get those essentials about the blood and the blood vessels. Because when we start talking about the heart, you have to be able to understand these basic fundamental concepts before we can get there. So just leave a comment and let us know how you did in the quiz or what you learned. Thanks.